Yesterday, Donald Trump was inaugurated.
Yes.
And he made what was, in my view, one of the best political speeches of the last decade. Did you hear it?
I didn't actually, because I was too busy with work and running my business.
Right. Well, it's worth, if you get a chance, it's worth scrolling back and listening to it, because it wasn't a great political speech in that it was rhetorical or fantastic. But what he did was, in very simple terms, laid out a plan of action for America for the next 4 years.
Yes.
And some of the things that he came up with, I'll run through a few of them.
Yeah, I've seen some of the headlines.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that some of the headlines that I've seen already, he's made some very decisive decisions, and decisions that should have been taken a long time ago.
Absolutely. And decisions which will not only affect America in the next 4 years, but will inevitably affect Britain in the next 4 years.
Of course, that's going to have a rollover.
I mean, one example is the leaving of the World Health Organization.
Yes.
Now, that presumably leaves any potential pandemic treaty or whatever in tatters. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I think it's important for each country to navigate their own way through any of the pandemics. We had a pandemic preparedness plan in the UK, and what did we do with it? We ripped it up and threw it away. And actually, if we'd gone with some of the recommendations for the pandemic preparedness plan, we would never have gone into lockdown.
But I mean, the point about the pandemic treaty was that if they had introduced it, it would have effectively tied our government's hands to go down whatever route the WHO said was correct.
Yeah.
And of course, that would, in my view, would have been catastrophic, because what's the point of having an elected government if you then outsource things like pandemic treaty to?
And that's outside the democratic, the powers of a government, and that's why, President Trump has ripped it up and said no.
Yeah, and as I say, I think the effect of that is effectively that it's dead. Mm-hmm. I mean, it may limp on, but it will have there's no momentum behind WHO now. So I think all its power is effectively drained. Mm. And similarly, he announced that he was going to withdraw America from the Paris Climate Accord. Mm-hmm. What do you think the effect of that's going to be?
Well, he did come out of the Paris Agreement previously, and he always said all along that he would come out of that. I think we have to look at the climate and how it changes. It's evolved for many thousands and thousands of years, and how we act on that should be a lot more measured, rather than actually making us poorer and colder, which is what the climate change. We were boiling 2 years ago, and all of a sudden we're cold now, and it's like, human nature, the Mother Nature, I should say. Mother Nature actually evolves through time, and it goes through patterns, so we have to adapt. We can't just have one size fits all.
Yes, I mean, a few years ago, the term they used was global warming, until the point at which everybody realised it wasn't getting warmer at all. So then they started talking about climate change, which of course is quite a good phrase, because it means that anything that happens, you can blame it on climate change.
And, this wording of, the science is settled. Science is never settled. That's why we have scientists. That's why we put funding into, universities and groups that actually can deliver different alternatives to what the narrative actually is at that precise moment in time. I remember as a child growing up and reading in the newspaper that we would have an ice age. I think that was 1980. And I remember as a child thinking, oh my goodness, how are we going to cope with it being so cold, etc., etc. And by 2000, all of a sudden came along, and I was like, we're not in an ice age, are we?
So, and the Maldives aren't underwater either.
Exactly. And, I think going back to climate change it does evolve and it changes, but we do need to absolutely adapt on what happens to our future generations, our grandchildren, all of that as well.
Well, I mean, Trump was quite clear yesterday that he was going to, in his words, exploit the natural resources that America has? Absolutely. So he's going to get as much money from the oil and gas that America has. So what this does, it seems to me, is effectively to scotch any prospect of net zero. Because, I mean, if America... I mean, we already know that India and China and so on our emissions are huge.
Yeah.
Britain's emission is absolutely tiny, and yet
0.1% or something like that.
Of 0.2%.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's absolutely minuscule.
Yeah.
So it makes the point ever more forcefully that our net zero policy, which is at the root of much of our economic decline, is just silly.
Yeah, and I think Zia said the other at the conference a couple of weeks ago that £300 per household, for this net zero, and our policy of scrapping net zero is actually about how do we adapt. It's that word again. How do we adapt to the climate? How do we adapt to some of the industries like steel and oil and all of that? And how do we find our own treasure, because we do know that our own treasure is underneath our feet, but how do we also adapt with nuclear energy? Some of the smaller nuclear reactors actually have a zero carbon footprint.
And we have great technology for building them. And
I was shouted down in some of the hustings by, suggesting that, and now all of a sudden it's like, actually, yeah, it does work, So I think for me it is about that adapting to the environment that is actually around you, but also how our families then adapt to that, and then our communities and ultimately the United Kingdom.
But yeah, as I say, in a world where drill baby drill is going on across the Atlantic, it just makes less and less sense.